Welcome to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast, a weekly podcast where you get to discover the truth claims, teachings, and practices of Christianity. Here's your host, Roland. In today's episode, we're going to consider which worldview best explains the information or the arguments that we've already considered for the existence of God. Now, in the previous episodes, we looked at 3 arguments for the existence of God. Just to remind ourselves, these arguments are firstly the Cosmological Argument, which goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, we looked at several lines of evidence, like the fact that the universe is expanding, to prove the validity of these arguments or this particular argument. Secondly, we looked at the Teleological Argument or the argument from design. And it goes like this. Every design has a designer. The universe has highly complex design. Therefore, the universe had a designer. Now, with regard to this argument, we looked at 8 anthropic constants, like the oxygen level, as well as the specified information within the human genome to substantiate this argument. Thirdly, we looked at the moral argument. And the argument goes like this. Every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. Now, we looked at 8 reasons why the moral law exists, including the fact that it is the basis for all human rights. Now, I think we did enough in the previous episodes to show the reasonableness of these arguments. Now, if these arguments are sound, then there is a cause to the universe. This cause is what philosophers call the prime reality, or the uncaused first cause. Or as theologians or Christians or theists might say, or religious people might say, simply God, okay? Not only do these arguments reasonably prove that God exists, but they also help us identify certain attributes that God, by definition, must have. These attributes include God must be uncaused. Since there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, God is the uncaused first cause of everything that came into being. Secondly, God must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. The cosmological argument proves that time, space, and matter had a beginning. Therefore, whatever created time, space, and matter cannot be comprised of time, space, or matter, meaning whatever created time, space, or matter must transcend time, space, or matter. Thirdly, God must be powerful. Again, the cosmological argument also proves that God must be extremely powerful to have created the universe from nothing. Fourthly, God must be intelligent. From the teleological argument, we learn that God is extremely intelligent, as evidenced by the specified complexity found throughout the universe. Fifthly, God must be personal. Only persons or personal agents make choices. To go from a state of complete nothingness to something, to go from nothing to a fully actualized universe, requires a choice. Now, remember, the laws of nature cannot be employed as an initiating causal force in this case, since the laws of nature didn't exist before the universe existed. Therefore, the cause of the universe must be personal, which is to say the cause of the universe must be a person. And sixth, God must be moral. As the standard for morality, God must be morally good, since morality is defined as what corresponds to God's very nature. Okay, so it's important to recognize that while we have reasonably concluded that God exists, we have not provided any evidence to prove that the God that exists is in fact a Christian God. Before we can do that, we first need to look at the major worldviews to see if their conceptualization of God matches the attributes that we have extrapolated from the arguments for the existence of God. So, what are the major worldviews as they relate to the existence of God? First, there's atheism, there's agnosticism, there's pantheism, there's panentheism, there's deism, and polytheism and monotheism. Now, everyone falls into one of the above mentioned worldviews, whether they know it or not. Let's take a closer look at each of these to see if they are consistent with the attributes of God that we have identified earlier. First, the atheism. So the term atheist is taken from the Greek term a, meaning no, and theos, meaning God. Placed together, the term means no God. The atheist then is one who does not believe in the existence of God. Atheists are often termed naturalists because they tend to only accept the existence of the physical world, thereby rejecting the existence of things like God, angels, or demons. This presents a problem for atheists when it comes to things like consciousness, which is in itself a non-material thing. Popular examples of atheists include Richard Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss. Now, as you can see, atheism is not compatible with the attributes of God that we considered earlier, since atheism does not even believe in the existence of God. Therefore, if the arguments for the existence of God hold true, then atheism as a worldview is false. Secondly, the second worldview we take a look at is agnosticism. Agnosticism comes from two Greek terms, a meaning no, and gnosis meaning knowledge. The agnostic doesn't necessarily reject belief in God. Rather, the agnostic claims no knowledge on the issue. Then we get to pantheism and panentheism. Now, while pantheism and panentheism might seem the same, there are subtle differences. Here is a clip by Dr. William Lane Craig where he explains the difference.
Okay, so let's begin with a clarification of terms for the sake of the audience. Pantheism means that the entire universe, all physical reality is itself God. It identifies the physical universe with God. Pantheism is characteristic of many Eastern religions, which deny that there is a transcendent creator of the universe who exists beyond space and time, who is himself immaterial, and who brings all physical reality into being. Panentheism, by contrast, is the view that physical reality exists in God. It doesn't exhaust God's being. It's not identical to God, as in pantheism, but it says that everything is in God. The physical universe somehow, in some mysterious ways, emanates out of the very beginning of God, out of the very being of God. So even if God is more than the universe, he is nothing less than the universe. The universe emanates or proceeds out of the very being of God.
As Dr. Craig explained, pantheism holds that the entire universe, that is to say all physical reality, is God. Buddhism is an example of pantheism. So based on our arguments, pantheism is false because the cause of the universe transcends the universe. The things that make up the universe, time, space, matter, and energy, had a beginning. Therefore, the God of the universe must necessarily transcend the universe. And if God transcends the universe, then he cannot logically be the universe. Now, of course, God as the creator of the universe can be displayed by and through the universe, but that is not the same as being identical to the universe. Now, in terms of panentheism maintains that physical reality is not identical to God, but that everything emanates from the very being of God. Although there is a difference between pantheism and panentheism, they share the same problems philosophically. For God to create the material universe out of himself, he would himself have to be material. But that contradicts the attributes of God that we considered earlier. Therefore, panentheism is false. An example of panentheism is Hinduism, or many variations of Hinduism. Then we get to deism. Deism comes from the Latin term deus, which means God. Deists believe in a transcendent God that created the universe but does not get involved in the universe. It's a kind of absent father view of God. The argument from design and morality pose distinct problems to deism. From the teleological argument, we learn that God did get involved in the universe sometime after he created it, because he created the first life. From the moral argument, we learn that God is the arbiter of right and wrong, since his nature is the standard for morality. Therefore, deism is false. Now we get to polytheism. The term polytheism comes from two Greek terms, polou, meaning many, and theos, meaning God. Therefore, a person holding to a polytheistic worldview believes that many gods or goddesses exist. The Greek and Roman gods would be examples of polytheism. The problem with polytheistic deities is that they themselves are seen as part of the universe. They are contingent beings, so their very existence must also be traced back to a first cause that precedes the universe. The infinity of God also excludes the possibility of multiple gods. Here is a clip by Dr. Frank Trigg where he explains what the infinity of God is.
All right, excellent. The question is, why is Christianity true and polytheism not? Well, we haven't proven Christianity is true here yet, but if our reasoning is good to this point, truth exists. A theistic God exists, which means he is the being that created the universe and sustains the universe. He happens to be an infinite being, and you can't have two infinites, all right? If there is an infinite being, in order to have another being, in order to have two infinites, one being would have to differ from the other being, but an infinite being doesn't lack any attributes. So you couldn't have two beings that lack attributes, or you couldn't have two beings that had all the attributes, had infinite attributes. It could only be one infinite being. That's why I think polytheism is false.
So then the infinity of God refers to the fact that God is infinite in all the attributes that he possesses. He possesses these attributes without end or limits. God lacks nothing. For example, if it is true that God is spaceless, then God is infinitely spaceless. If it is true that God is timeless, then God is infinitely timeless. If it is true that God is powerful, then God is infinitely powerful. Therefore, if God exists, then he exists infinitely. So if there are two beings that possess the same attributes without end or limit, then how would you tell them apart? The infinity of one of the beings would be a limitation to the other. So the infinity of God is based on the ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, I did not include the ontological argument when we were considering the existence of God because it can seem abstract and it is, quite frankly, difficult to navigate. However, here is a clip by William Lane Craig where he examines the ontological argument to help us understand the notion of the infinity of God.
The ontological argument is an argument intended to show that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God exists. So if this argument is sound, it puts the atheist in a very awkward position. The atheist must deny not merely that God exists, he must maintain that it is impossible that God exists. And that is certainly a radical claim that would require great justification. The ontological argument goes something like this. God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. Now, what would the greatest conceivable being be like? Well, he would be omnipotent. He would be omniscient. He would be all good. And he would be necessary in his existence. He would exist in all possible worlds. Now, if such a being is possible, that means that a being like that exists in some possible world. But you see, if a being of that nature exists in even one possible world, then it exists in all of them, because that's part of what it means to be the greatest conceivable being. But if it exists in all of them, then it exists in the actual world, therefore God exists. So the argument is basically, if you think that God's existence is possible, then it follows that God exists. So do you think it's possible that God exists? Well, I do. It seems to me that the concept of a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and necessarily existent is a coherent concept that's possibly instantiated, and therefore I believe that God does exist.
Beautiful. Okay, so if God is the greatest possible being, and if God is infinite in all his attributes, then there can only be one God. There can only be one. This leads us to the final worldview, monotheism. Monotheism comes from two Greek terms, mono, meaning one, and theism, which means God. Monotheists believe that God is self-existent, eternal, and both transcendent, meaning separate from creation, and immanent, meaning working within creation. Thus, God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omniscient, all-knowing. But God is also all-good and omnipresent. God is infinite. The theist believes that God is beyond the laws of nature and yet sustains the laws of nature. The theist also believes that God is personal and reveals himself to humanity. There are three main monotheistic religions, and they include Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Monotheism is perfectly compatible with the attributes of God that we have identified from the arguments for the existence of God. Okay, so that's all from me today. Let's recap. In today's episode, we learned that for any being to be God, they must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal, powerful, moral, and infinite. We also considered the different worldviews and confirmed that monotheism is most compatible with these characteristics of God. Now, we know that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the major monotheistic religions, but they contradict each other in terms of their understanding of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Christians believe that Jesus is God, while Muslims and Jews deny this claim. Therefore, if Christianity is true, then Judaism and Islam is false. Or at least Judaism might be half true. Okay? Now, in the next episode, I will present the evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. Now, why is this important? If the New Testament is reliable, then we can consider Jesus' claims to be God. And we can do so objectively. And if Jesus' claim to be God is true, then Christianity is true. And if Christianity is true, then every other religion that contradicts Christianity is false. Okay, thank you guys for listening. I hope this has been insightful. And until the next time, remember, the truth matters, and so do you.